for the Sci-Fi Christian. You know, on the last Rings of Power video for last week's episode, there was just a great comment that said that me sitting here with a bad lighting and a bad camera, nothing but me in a recliner smoking a cigar is exactly what this show deserves. I couldn't agree more. You know, it's like there's two categories out there. You either have money to do stuff and have actual production values, or you should just own the fact that you're a guy sitting in his recliner. Like, I hate all these videos that pretend like they have a fancy production crew and don't. Not here. We're honest about how incredibly cheap this is. Me in a recliner. If you don't like it, find another YouTube channel. This is what you get. All right, so today we're going to talk about how to fix the Rings of Power. I've been thinking about this for a while. Now, you could say the show is, at this point, a complete wash. It's a disaster. I don't even want it fixed. All fair, all fair. But I think for a lot of us, including those of us who are getting a Schadenfreude-esque experience out of this show, the world would be better if we had a if we must have a Tolkien show, the world would be better if it was a competent one that was actually good. And believe it or not, I think there's some relatively simple adjustments that you could take to get there. Now, I'm going to give you some of mine, and one thing you're going to notice is that virtually none of them are like, well, this should be Galadriel's story or blah, 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 because I actually don't think that's the root of the problem. Now, there's a lot of problems in the storytelling. There's a lot of problems in the choices and the dialogue and a lot of things you critique. But just saying, like, have better dialogue. Okay, well, let's say they did have better dialogue. Does that fix the show? No. Like, this is a root cause analysis we're doing here. There are deep underlying problems to this show that are well before and beyond the script stage. So I have a couple of things we'll hit on that are related to choices on screen, but I honestly think most of the problems are off screen. They're with the attitude of that they're bringing to Tolkien, bringing to the show. So a couple of assumptions I'm going to make, which is that I am coming from a perspective that simultaneously is not saying, well, if you deviate one iota from the lore, you failed. Okay, we all get that they don't have the rights to everything. One of my suggestions is not go get the rights to the Silmarillion. If they don't have the rights to things, if you're going to do this, it's going to be different than Tolkien. Okay, and even if you are directly adapting Tolkien like Peter Jackson, you're going to make choices that are different. That's just the nature of adaptation. So this is not an argument that, well, you should be more faithful to the books. Maybe, but that's not the deeper issue. Simultaneously to that, I'm coming from the perspective that says, if you're going to adapt Tolkien or adapt something in his world, you're paying for more than just the name, or at least you should be. You should actually make an effort to make something set in Lord of the Rings. So we don't need to be chained to the lore, but also we don't need to just make it Tolkien in name only. I know there's people who are on that side and don't care, just make a good show. Well, A, they haven't, and B, no, if you're going to use the name, actually try and make something that fits with the world. And so far, they've completely failed to do that. So that's my contention. All right, let's get into it. So the first couple here are going to be around the controversy for the show. All this controversy, and specifically the way that Amazon is completely failing to handle it. So my first suggestion to Amazon, I'm going to just bring up my notes here so I don't miss any of these points, because I'm giving this to Amazon free of charge, and I want Daddy Jeff, should he have in the 1 in a billion chance of stumbling across this video. I don't want to miss any of the gold I have for you, Daddy Jeff. Daddy Jeff is Jeff Bezos, for those of you not keeping track at home. Okay, so advice point number 1. Stop hiding behind racists. Stop hiding behind racists. Now you think, wait a second, Amazon aren't the racists. That's all the people who are criticizing the show, right? That's what I read on Twitter and Reddit, right? That's got to be it. Wrong. Let me explain this to you. And this is specifically when it comes to the issue of the casting and the diversity. There are three camps out there. There's a teeny tiny camp of trolls, racists who are very loud, and we're not going to listen to them. You know, if the whole reason you don't like the show is because you don't like black people, I don't have anything to say to you. That's like there's not even a conversation there. So we're just done with them. Second, there's a very large group of people who are have genuine criticisms of the show, including some that are related to the casting. We'll talk about those specifically more in just a minute. But yes, you can say, wait a second, this feels a little anachronistic. This feels a little like we're breaking verisimilitude to have a band of 20 hobbits and they're totally diverse. Like, that's a fair opinion, and you can have that opinion without being a racist. Okay? And then there's tons of people criticizing the show who aren't bringing up race at all. And then there's another group over here, which is Amazon, Daddy Jeff, and all of the defenders of the show. And what's happening right now? This large group in the middle is making lots of criticisms. Some of them I'm sure are not valid. A lot of them are. I'm in this camp. And every time Daddy Jeff and company choose to respond, they don't respond to them. They respond to the trolls and racists. That tiny group over here who none of us care about. We don't care about them. They're beneath our contempt. It's just, like, again, I don't know of anybody who's criticizing the show because there are black people. In other words, different than saying, well, this doesn't quite fit with the verisimilitude in the world, and I just don't like black people. I don't know anybody who's criticizing for that, but I know they're out there. The internet's a big place. So anybody who takes that opinion, no time for you. But here's what Amazon's doing. It's actually using those people to shield themselves from the real criticism. Oh, I don't have to respond to the real criticism about how horrible this show is, how bad Galadriel's character is, because someone on the internet was a racist. So I'm just going to respond to that and use that to blanket all the criticism. I think of this as the death threat phenomenon. Okay, so what's the death threat phenomenon? Well, if you've ever followed any controversy on Twitter, somebody does something controversial or anything they're being ripped for, and they're getting criticized for it. It doesn't matter if the criticism or issue are valid or invalid, whatever. Eventually, that person will come out, and this happens right, left, center, politics, pop culture, all over the place, and they'll announce, I'm getting death threats. Okay? And they do it in such a way to be like, wow, you people criticizing me, look at what's happening to me. How can you keep criticizing me? Now, here's the problem with that. Death threats, and I mean serious ones, I don't mean like jokey ones, but serious ones, and they'll post screenshots and all of this. Death threats, of course, are not appropriate. We don't like that. We're not in favor of it. But guess what? The fact that you received horrible comments doesn't invalidate legitimate criticism of you. It just doesn't. You don't get to hide behind the fact that people were assholes to you on the internet to avoid criticism. Likewise, Daddy Jeff and Amazon, you don't get to hide behind the fact that there's a teeny tiny minority of genuine racist assholes in order to avoid all the real criticism. So stop hiding behind that and then actually just address the critics out there. That's your first step to improving as Rings of Power. Admit that you have a problem. Second part to this, my second piece of advice. Once you've decided to do this, you're going to quickly find that everyone is ready to move on from the issue of diversity in casting. Every single person out there. Why? Because even if people have been like, that doesn't quite fit, they now watch the show, they're like, you know what? So many bigger things to fry, let's not even worry about it. Those are the comments I'm seeing. Again, it's not literally everybody, but virtually everyone is. So Amazon, here's your next step. You're going to deliver a kill shot to the whole conversation. What do I mean by kill shot? You're going to make a comment about it that doesn't lump everybody into the group of racists, that addresses the issue head on. The real concern, not the I don't like black people, but the real one that says, hey, this doesn't quite fit from a realism perspective. And you're not going to do it by saying, well, dragons aren't real either. You know, that's, by the way, just that criticism of defense just drives me nuts. Yeah, dragons aren't realistic, but there is such a thing as internal consistency even in a fantasy world. If you don't understand that concept, you shouldn't be working in the genre. Whatever. Okay, so here's how you do this. You say, um, J.R.R. Tolkien envisioned his mythos as becoming part of the mythic consciousness of the British people. Probably have to dumb this down a bit for the average Joe, but they can workshop it later. And right now, all of the critics' ears are perking up because that's what they say. Like, wait a second, this is supposed to be an apology for, you know, ancient Britain. Why does it, you know, it would make sense that there wasn't diversity. So you start there. Tolkien wanted his mythos to be part of the mythic consciousness of the British people. And he not only succeeded in that, he succeeded in becoming part of the mythic consciousness for all of Western civilization, and maybe even beyond. Because of that, Lord of the Rings and things Tolkien wrote have become foundational myths for us as a people. And that's why we've chosen to break verisimilitude to reflect that type of diversity. Like, that's it. That's all you have to say. You're making a sound defense. Not everybody's going to agree with it. That's fine. People can disagree with that. But you're not saying, well, anybody who disagrees with me is racist. You're saying because of this whole, you know, that Tolkien has become foundational for Western civilization as a whole, that puts it in a different category. Similarly to how we have anachronistic casting choices when adapting Shakespeare. Like the Coen brother, or it wasn't both Coens, but the Coen adaptation of Macbeth. Denzel Washington playing Macbeth. But we accept that with Shakespeare because it's so foundational to us. That's all you have to do. People are going to disagree with that, but now you've given a reasonable defense. Move on. Move on. Okay, so now we've admitted we have a problem. We've addressed the big controversy that everybody just wants to move on from because the show has bigger problems. Now let's get into a couple things. These next couple are kind of my take within the world itself. Okay, so first one is stop inviting comparisons you come out on the wrong side of. Specifically, stop echoing the Peter Jackson trilogy, the Lord of the Rings one. Nobody wants to echo the Hobbit trilogy. But just stop. Like, they keep having moments and shots and everything that just are intentionally drawing you back to what Peter Jackson did. So what the hell are you doing? This is better than you. Number one, you're coming up on the wrong side of the comparison. Every time you do this, you're just reminding us of Tolkien works that are better than what you're doing. So what's the point? Okay? But number two, Peter Jackson isn't the final word on Tolkien on film. I don't take anything away from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think they're phenomenal. They may very well be the best adaptation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy that we could ever hope to get. That might be true. But they're not the final word on Tolkien visually or anything else. So stop it. You know, chart your own course. You don't just echo something better than you and do a worse job because you come out on the wrong side of it and it's horrible. Number two, when it comes to on-screen stuff, stop confusing looking good with looking expensive. Okay? Now, this is the thing where even the critics of the show come out and they're like, well, the visuals are good. Yeah, some of them. Some of them look good. Other ones just look expensive. Not the same. When you watch the Star Wars prequels, they look expensive. At the time they were. They don't look good, right? Now, conversely, the original Star Wars trilogy does not look expensive because it wasn't, but it looks damn good. Like, it's immersive. Not in the same way as, you know, having $1 billion budget, but yeah, they made a really expensive looking show that I don't believe for a second when I'm watching it. Stop confusing looking expensive with looking good. Okay. Number whatever we're on. 5. I got 7, but the last one's got a few sub-points to it. Number 5, Tolkien doesn't need a refresh. Okay? This is one of the problems that we have, is that we have people who are making Tolkien and they're embarrassed by the things he believed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But specifically, he was a Roman Catholic, and he probably had some views that we wouldn't approve of in the year 2022. And it's like, okay, I get that if you're gonna remake Gone with the Wind or something, there's probably a few things to do a little differently, right? But that's not Tolkien. Okay? He doesn't need a refresh. He doesn't need it either in terms of we don't need to be embarrassed about the things he believed. You know, I have here the letters of Tolkien that we're going to have a couple excerpts from in just a second. Nowhere in here does he say, you know what, Hitler had some good ideas. No! Tolkien doesn't need a refresh. And he also doesn't need it in terms of his aesthetic, his dialogue, his anything. Like, these are people who are like, let's bring Tolkien into the year 2022. No! Hello, Joseph. No, let's not do that. Let's bring ourselves back to his world. Like, I live here all the time. I don't need Tolkien for the Twitter generation. I need the Twitter generation to go to Tolkien. Doesn't need a refresh. Doesn't, so stop it. Okay, number 6. Details matter when you're making a Tolkien story. Here's what I don't mean by that. This isn't saying that we need to be handcuffed to the lore. It would be nice. It'd be nice to maybe be a little bit closer. But no, what I do mean is Tolkien developed his world with intense care and intense attention to detail. You're talking about a world that began from a language exercise. Like, he's inventing his own language. So this is a world that grew out of the details. And so far, this show is the exact opposite. Like, we're coming down with this big plan, and the details don't really matter. It doesn't mean that we need to be like ultra anal, and you can never take a dramatic choice that maybe isn't strictly realistic, or you can't even do the casting stuff we were talking about earlier. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying details matter. Like, when we see not Celeborn, Celebrimbor and Elrond talking about going to Khazad-dûm. We see the map, and then 2 seconds later, they're just walking around the corner with no sense of time or journeying or anything like that. It makes the world feel small. Why? Because you ignored the details. You ignored it. People read Lord of the Rings, like, holy crap, he's describing grass again. Yeah, why? Because the details mattered. You don't have to have all the same details that the books did, but you need to care about that stuff if you're going to make a successful series in this world. It's not an abstract experience. Don't treat it like one. You can't just impose this pop culture ethic from the top down. Doesn't work. Doesn't work, and it's the main reason you're failing. And that finally brings me to my last one. And this is the biggest issue with why Rings of Power is failing. If you're going to make a Tolkien show, you need to appreciate, like, on a deep level, and understand what drove Tolkien as a thinker. Okay? What do I mean by that? Like, when you read Lord of the Rings, and you read the character of Galadriel, there are Marian aspects to that, as in the Virgin Mary, right? Tolkien's Catholicism and the character of Galadriel is on center stage. When we see the elves and the Fellowship eating lembas, the Eucharist, communion, from a Roman Catholic perspective, is on center stage. But we're not Catholic. Okay, fine. I never said you have to believe it. I never said you have to agree with it. But you want to play in this world, you could at least understand what made Tolkien think. Another example for you. One of the most absurd moments in the show so far is when, it's Mordor, so that the evil people can have a place of their own, where evil can thrive. What a shallow view of what Tolkien's trying to do with Mordor. Where does Mordor come from? It comes from the trenches of World War I. Really? Like, Tolkien's looking at this, and he's going through the hell that was World War I, and that is where Mordor was originally born out of. Now, it grew and expanded from there, but this isn't, I hope they can have a place of their own. Like, this is coming from a place of deep agony, terror, and watching humanity create a hell. Take creation and turn it into hell. Literally. Hell on earth. That's what I mean. You don't have to necessarily agree with what Tolkien believed about hell. You don't have to disagree with it. But if you're going to talk about Mordor, like, you have to take the time to put yourself there into that moment. And then I would argue that there's two main concepts that drive Tolkien. There's more than that. But if you want to just boil it down to two. So if the showrunner said, okay, I hear you, Daddy Jeff's like, okay, I hear you, what are the top two that you should, things you should understand about Tolkien in terms of his thinking and the thinking that just poured into Lord of the Rings? And there are two, in fact. There's the long defeat, and there's the concept of eucatastrophe. Now, what are these? Okay, let's start with the long defeat, because this actually is quoted directly by Galadriel to Frodo in the Mirror of Galadriel chapter. So there's a concept within Tolkien and within the world that Lord of the Rings is actually a tragedy. It's about the doom of the elves. They're going to destroy the ring that defeats Sauron, but guess what? It also defeats the elves. Everything they've built, it's the undoing. And it's like the elves have been waging this millennia-long battle, and it's the long defeat, you know? And like, there's this deeply noble aspect to that, yeah, this ends in our end, but it's still worth doing. It's still worth fighting. There's so much depth and tragedy to that. And it comes from the way Tolkien viewed the world. So I'm going to just read a quick excerpt here. Again, Letters of J.R. Tolkien, recommended if you're a fan. This is from letter 195, and it's an excerpt from there. And he says, 1 point, Frodo's attitude to weapons was personal. He was not in modern terms a pacifist. He's referring to the moment in the Scouring of the Shire where Frodo doesn't want to pick up a weapon. Of course, he was mainly horrified at the prospect of civil war among hobbits, but he had, I suppose, also reached the conclusion that physical fighting is actually less ultimately effective than most good men think it is. Actually, I am a Christian and indeed a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpses of final victory. So this goes completely counter to the popular notion that we're progressing towards some justice-laden utopia. Like, maybe, but Tolkien didn't think that, so it's not as though you have to change your mind. You can disagree with him. But do you understand it? Do you understand the sorrow, but also the hope that drives somebody to believe in the long defeat? And to make that a cornerstone of how you think about the world, how you think about history, how you think about theology. That changes you. And if you don't get that, you're not ready to write in this world. Sorry, but you're incompetent. I don't care how many billions of dollars you have, you buffoons. The second idea, though, which is what pairs with it brilliantly, is that of eucatastrophe. Now, eucatastrophe, of course, comes from, it's a coinage of Tolkien, and he's going to address that here, but it comes from the term for Eucharist, which is the Roman Catholic term for communion, the bread and the wine. We believe, I'm Catholic, we believe it's literally the body and blood of Christ as it is consecrated for the Mass. You don't have to believe any of that, but we're trying to get inside Tolkien's head. So what does he say about eucatastrophe? He says, I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which I argued is the highest function of fairy stories to produce. And I was there led to the view that it produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth, your whole nature chained to material cause and effect. The chain of death feels a sudden relief, as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. It perceives, if the story is literally truth on the second plane, that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. And I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible in the greatest fairy story and produces the essential emotion, Christian joy, which produces tears because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled as selfishness and altruism are lost in love. Powerful ideas there. Like, really powerful. So what's he saying? On the one hand, we have the long defeat, and then just when we're at that darkest moment, something happens. So let's think about this in terms of Tolkien. Let's think about this in terms of one of the dumbest internet debates about Lord of the Rings. The fucking Eagles. Okay? Oh, the Eagles? Why didn't they just ride the Eagles the whole way? You idiots. If you're asking that question, you don't understand Tolkien. You don't. The Eagles matter because they're you catastrophe. Like that moment at the gates of Mordor where it's all done and then unexpected grace shows up. So if you look at that and it's like, well, why didn't they ride the Eagles? Or that's kind of cheap that the Eagles showed up. Lame. It's like you failed. You catastrophe is not just a cheap trick to get around a tricky plot point. It's a fundamental aspect of how Tolkien saw the world. It is the hand of God within the long defeat. Literally. Literally. Again, you don't have to believe that. You don't have to believe in the resurrection. You don't have to believe in that view of the resurrection. But if you're going to play in Tolkien's world and you don't understand that perspective, and not just like academically, but you haven't actually empathized on a deep level with that perspective, you're not ready to work in this world. So when I say the issue isn't the script, the issue isn't the dialogue, the issue isn't the acting, all of those, to the extent that they're bad, are symptoms. The issue is these people making the show have failed utterly to understand how Tolkien thinks. 7 points, but honestly, if they could nail that last one, this show would come back for a second season and it would be completely different. They've said that they aspire for this show to be the equivalent of a book that could sit on the bookshelf right alongside Lord of the Rings. You want to get there, get inside Tolkien's head, think how he thinks, approach the world how he approaches, and then if you disagree, go about your life. But until you're willing to do that and take that on, you're not prepared. You're not prepared to write with Lord of the Rings. And that's why they're failing. And that's why the best we can get out of this show is some very hilarious moments watching them fall flat on their face. It's the best we can hope for because they failed in every way that matters. All right, that's a little pessimistic Rings of Power take. We'll be back to laugh at these buffoons more tomorrow. Episode post tonight. I'm not going to watch it tonight. I'll watch it tomorrow. We'll do a video tomorrow. It's going to be fun. They'll keep failing. We'll keep laughing. Andy Bono, Sci-Fi Christian. We'll talk later. Bye.